All right, let's get started for our second to last session for this semester, which feels pretty weird to say, to be fair. I know I sent you an email and said we would start with the reading exercise that we kind of started off with last week, but then I was succinctly informed that some of the presentations might take a bit longer, and because I do not want to, at least, in one session, I do not want to rush people through their presentations. Finally, we're going to start off with the presentations and class, and then depending on how much time we have, we'll either talk about our alternative reading exercise of last week, or, which I think will be much more likely in this case, we'll move that reading exercise to next week to give everyone else kind of the time to read those texts, and then we can go through it. I know I tend to, push these exercises to the, on the back burner really, but I would like to take the time to actually talk about those texts and not go, so now tell me within 30 seconds to do this, that, and the other. And I think 15 minutes for these two texts is just a bit not enough to actually really properly talk to, not to them, you don't talk to the text, but you talk, to one another and to me about the text. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to start off with talking about Lady Chatterley's Lover and Class. So finally we'll go back to the book that we ought to have read in the beginning of the semester. It's amazing. I noticed that we haven't talked about Lady Chatterley's Lover for quite a while, but you haven't really complained, and I think that's a good sign in this case. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to start with class, namely theory, then have a brief historical overview of a class in the 1920s and 30s, which is basically exactly the point where this book is located, and then we'll move on to talk about Lady Chatterley's Lover, which means that you know the drill. There will be a lot of technical fumbling around right here. So there's that. If you have any questions, I think the presenters will be very happy to answer them, which is why the floor is open to you. Yes, you can do it. Whoever said that very quietly. Okay. Just ignore that. Do you want to stand over there? Okay, then I'm going to give you this so that you can actually do that. And I'm going to hand the... Wait a second, that doesn't work so far. Wait a sec. But now it should. Try it again. Yeah, that's how it should work.
Oh, no, actually, maybe I'll stand there so I can see the problem.
Okay, brilliant. That's your microphone.
Can I, put this on here?
Yeah. I'll just hold it in my hand so that I don't have to do the fumbling back and forth kind of thing. Okay. There's that. For a second, I want to say, put it in one of your pockets, but you don't have one. You can also hold it in your hand. Don't trip over the wire. And I think people might actually be able to see you in a second.
Oh, I'm in there.
Yes.
Hello.
Now you. So it's yours.
Okay. All right, so welcome everyone watching from YouTube to our presentation today. We are going to talk about sexuality in class and Lady Chatterley's Lover. And as you can already see, I will talk about some class theory at first. So this is my structure. At first, I will give an introduction to the term class and some sort of short history of the term. Then I will talk about the three-component theory of stratification by Max Weber, the social space and habitus by Pierre Bourdieu, and then I will show you something that's called the Great British Class Calculator, but what that is you will see. And of course, lastly, my sources. Okay. So let's look at the term class. You might already have an idea in your head when you think about class. So I've brought some definitions according to the Oxford English Dictionary. We have a set or a category of things having some related properties or attributes in common, grouped together and differentiated from others under a general name or description, a kind, a sort. And then we have a definition that's maybe more close to what we will talk about today. So class as a division or stratum of society consisting of people at the same economic level or having the same social status. or a system of ordering society whereby people are divided into strata, the pattern of social division created by such a system, and a person's position in society. And of course we also have the verb to class, so we can place someone in a class, we can assign, regard as belonging to a particular category, and to arrange in or analyze into classes according to shared qualities or characteristics. But actually looking at class, social class refers to the hierarchical distinctions between individuals or groups in societies or cultures. We see class as universal, but it varies widely from one society to another. So one society itself might even have different ideas of what's supposed to be higher or lower in a hierarchy. And of course, class is associated with social status, or it can be associated with social status or one's position, social position in a culture. And obviously, it becomes even more difficult to define culture in an increasingly fluid and globalized society. Some of the more famous theorists are the theories of Karl Marx and Max Weber. But what also needs to be said about class is that generally any system that divides people and then assigns different values to the groups is inherently problematic, and can sort of like, we have a problem with the maintenance of a harmonious society when we categorize people into classes. And so for most of recorded human history, we've had agricultural societies where we had two classes, the ones who owned the productive agricultural land and the ones who worked for the landowners. And in the 1770s, we actually have the term social class first, where it first enters the English lexicon, but I also found the etymology of the word class, so where obviously we think about class as like a group of students like we are right here, but the meaning of class as a division of society according to status, like upper, lower status class, is actually from 1763. And so the middle class at that time during the 1770s was also becoming very important. And actually the Industrial Revolution allowed more time for like education and the refinement of like cultural things or hobbies or more like leisure. And so that's also the point where we're sort of like introducing or have been introduced a middle class. And kind of today that's very generalized to say that we have kind of like three categories when we think of class. Usually we think of like an upper class, so the ones who have the power, the lower class who we usually think of as workers, and the one who don't really own any property and who really rely on their wages. And then we have the middle class, who are people who, they're above the lower class, but they don't really exert power over others, but they do control their own life in some way. Okay, and actually in Victorian Britain, Karl Marx became the first person to critically attack the privileges, and I'm not going to talk about Karl Marx today, but just short, he defined class in terms of the extent to which an individual or a social group has control over the means of production. So whoever has that control is basically the dominant class. He called that the capitalists or the bourgeoisie. And then we have the wage workers, who are the proletariat. Those are kind of like the people who produce the goods and the services. Yeah. And yes, he wrote that down in his Communist Manifesto, but like I said, I'm not going to talk about Marx today. I'm going to talk about the three-component theory of stratification by Max Weber, who lived from 1864 to 1920, and he was a German sociologist. So he basically had three components of stratification with class, status, and party. So we have the economic class, which is our income, our goods and services that an individual has or possesses. The social status, so his prestige and his honor. And then we have political power, that's basically the party one can belong to, and that's the power an individual exercises. And that's all subordinate to the ownership of the means of production. So we have, or Max Weber kind of like saw classes as a category of population with similar life chances. So that means similar opportunities for acquiring or maintaining a characteristic range of material goods and life experiences. And he made a clear distinction between social status and class status. So class used in the sense of like status group was basically like the real community with like your honor and your prestige, and the class status more is like an economic class, more of the way to control your own economic environment, right? And the social status is like the positive or negative privileges with respect to social prestige. Okay, so to sum this up, property differences generate classes, but power differences generate status groupings or strata. So power is our main element in this three-component theory. And economic classes do not normally constitute communities, status groups do. Okay. Let's move on to the social space and habitus. This is a theory that was made or created by Pierre Bourdieu. You've probably heard of him already. If you've been studying maybe a bit longer. He was a French sociologist, and so we're going to have quite a social approach to this. And he basically created or had this idea of three different forms of capitals. So we have the economic capital, cultural capital, and social capital. Economic capital is basically one's total wealth, income, and property ownership all taken together as one. So money, property. Then we have cultural capital, which we can find in three different forms. Those are basically the institutionalized cultural capital, so our educational qualifications. Then the embodied form of cultural capital, which is the language. And also, I need to, that I get this right, not only the language, but also like using elaborate, extended vocabulary, using correct grammar, and sort of like a certain mode of language. And then he also talked about a symbolic mastery, which is like having a handle on abstract symbolic systems. So for instance, if you go somewhere and you see an artwork that's impressionist, you would recognize this artwork as impressionist, and that's kind of like having this symbolic mastery and being above someone else who wouldn't realize that or notice that. And then we have the, oh shit. Oh. And then we have the objectified cultural capital, which is the possession of cultural objects or the possession of artwork or of instruments. Yes. And then we have the social capital, which are our social networks and our associations with particular names, clubs, and families that, for instance, open doors or like get a special treatment and opportunities. And then he actually also talked about a fourth capital, which is the symbolic capital that I don't have on here. But to make it really simple or short, it's kind of like a reputation or prestige that someone has. And so people possess, from all these capitals, people possess different levels and combinations. And for that, Bourdieu created the so-called social space. So if we look at the vertical axis, we have the total amount of capital one can hold. So the more you have, the higher you go. And then on the left, we have, like for instance, having a lot of cultural capital, but not a lot of economic. And then having more economic capital, but like less cultural capital. And then there's also like a third axis, which is time or trajectory. So when people, so first of all, classes are understood as clouds or clusters. So they aren't really like set groups, they're more like clusters. So people that kind of are in this area, you could kind of take them together for like analytical purposes. But that doesn't mean that in reality, everyone who's here in that social space is a unified class. That's not the case. And so I've brought some examples. And so students, for instance, we would put them more in like a, that's us by the way, that could be more like in the direction of cultural capital, but not really a lot of economic capital yet, hopefully. And then we have farmers who are more like on the right side, so they have more economic capital, but according to Bourdieu, they wouldn't have a lot of cultural capital. And then on the left side, we would have higher education teachers who have more cultural capital. And then we have industrialists who have really a lot of economic capital. Okay, and so where you are in this social space kind of like determines your, it's like a relative distance from material necessity. So obviously if you're in the upper part of this, you have a good amount of capital and you're subject to an overall distance from necessity. And what also comes with that is that if you like have a lot of economic capital, for instance, you have more time to build more cultural capital because you don't need to worry about building economic capital. And that's also why sometimes people are like more on the lower side of this when they don't have a lot of economic capital, they don't have a lot of cultural capital because they struggle to build cultural capital because they're so busy actually maintaining their work and getting food and feeding their families. And obviously also if you have a lot of economic capital, you also get more cultural capital because, for instance, you're able to attend like the best universities in the countries, and then you get the best education and you meet a lot of influential people and you can build your social network, then you get more social capital. So that's kind of like the idea. And when you're like up in the social space, you can like be playful, you can emphasize form over function, manner over matter, or style over substance.
Can I interrupt, or do you
Yes.
want to go on?
You can interrupt me.
Okay, because it's not a, this is a mistake, but could you comment, because you've right now already commented a bit on social capital.
Yes.
And I just want to, because what you're introducing, and that is mostly a sort of cautionary comment, because what you've said is basically, farmers, they don't have a lot of cultural capital, but you have a lot of economic capital, which is not always the case, but in Bourdieu's terms, all right. The problem is because at some point you just said, more economic capital means you have more cultural capital, or at least more time to build cultural capital. And the problem is with that, farmers, for instance, they don't. There are a couple of statuses, a couple of groups that can't do that simply because cultural capital is something you're kind of sort of born with. So cultural capital exists in a number of forms. Some of it is
Habitus.
Is that something you're going to address, or?
Yes, I will talk about habitus.
Okay, then let me go back on that.
I didn't even see that. I was like, I'm just going to do that. It's here.
Don't essentialize these things because cultural capital is something, it's about taste, in which group, in which class you're born. That's really, really important for Bourdieu. Because, and I think you're going to say that simply,
yes.
I'm going to get back to that in a moment after you're done. So before I take half of your presentation away, I'm going to shut up and let you talk.
No, it's completely fine. It's okay. And so I brought the food space. This is from Bourdieu's book, and he, like for instance, where I said like if you have like a lot of economic capital because you're kind of like also born into an upper class, like you have time to be more playful, to say it like that. Like for instance, people on the upper like half, or like on the upper general side of the social space, like they can eat like delicate food, refined food, light food, really food that is first of all expensive, but it's also kind of like playful. And if you're like on the lower end of this social space, you might be more interested in like cheap food, nourishing food, really that's kind of like just feeding you at the end of the day because you're so busy doing that. Right. Okay. Like I said, those in the lower sections, they have less capital, so they need to invest more time to pay in paying bills, earning money, and so they tend to struggle to build cultural capital because they're busy keeping up their economic capital. Right. Okay. Good. Where was I? I was like confused. Okay, no. And so the people considered the dominant, or the ones on the upper half, they also like possess the power to define what has value and what doesn't, because at the end of the day, it's kind of abstract to say, oh well, I don't know, something is like considered higher in a hierarchy or lower, but that's usually because they already possess power in education and media and politics, and those are kind of like all institutions that generally shape our ideas and have an influence in what we think is like a higher lifestyle or a lower lifestyle. And so I did this like a class on class in my first semester, and the professor said, why don't we ever ask the questions, why aren't we just happy where we are? We always aspire to like move up the social ladder, like to have that social upward mobility, but like we never really ask ourselves, aren't we happy where we are? We always aspire to go up for some reason, because it's kind of like in our face that we're supposed to like always have lots of economic capital and cultural capital, because that's the way to go. And so basically lifestyle practices, goods and activities correspond to positions in the social space and are like indicator of one's class positions. And those in similar positions within the social space, they share, or with similar levels and types of capital, they share similar conditions of life. Kind of like people as clusters or as clouds in this whole social capital. Right, and so Bourdieu's idea, coming to Habitus, was that these different conditions of existence produce different habitus. And habitus, before I read that scary definition out loud, is basically like your tastes, your dispositions, and the way you behave. And I'm just going to read that out loud. So every person's complex of durable dispositions, propensities, or inclinations to do certain things are tastes and our likes. But most fundamentally, it is how we see, appreciate, and value things, all ultimately manifesting a lifestyle and making us who we are. Our habitus is produced through practical adaptations to the situation and probabilities that come with certain conditions of existence. And so this whole idea is that basically the way, or kind of like already the family and the position that we're born into really influences the way we are. And so you can already kind of see, I think this was the example with like going to university when you're from a lower class, like someone who's like from an upper class will probably see that you're like from a family maybe with a lower income just by the way you talk. Maybe you talk with a dialect, or you don't use that correct grammar or the extensive vocabulary all the time. And so also the way you behave, maybe the way you stand up or like this, or the way you talk to other people. And if you want to change that habitus, according to Bourdieu, you could possibly do that, but you would have to work really hard to do that. And I've brought like an example. So if we think of a professor, we probably think, okay, high cultural, economic, and social capital. So they're really smart, and when they go home, they probably read lots of books, and they have lots of money because they have this position at university. And when we think of them, what they do in their free time at the weekend, we probably think, well, they're going to the theater or to a concert or to the opera house. And it would be really weird, well, maybe with some professors, if you would see them at like a rock concert, you would be like, something's not right. And that's basically this whole idea. Yeah. And so there's also the very last thing. There's sort of like a class sense where we can like we can see lifestyle practices of other people, and we can usually immediately judge whether the other individual is higher or lower than us, or more or less intelligent or cultured. And that's kind of like this class sense that we can already see. Maybe someone is coming from this background or from that, and that's basically. Hopefully, I explained this correctly. Yeah. The habitus of Pierre Bourdieu. And then lastly, because this was also something that we did, I don't know how long I've been talking. Because the thing is, there's a great British class calculator. I don't know if you know this. Do you know this?
No, I don't.
Maybe I could open it if that's possible.
Everything is possible. It just takes a minute or two.
Yeah, that's the link.
Ah, wait.
No, just that's already my result. The link, so we can open it in the like Explorer.
Honestly, it doesn't want me to open that, because of course PowerPoint never wants me to do any of these things. So let's do the old school kind of thing. And there.
Okay, fantastic.
Okay.
So that's also something I learned in my first semester. So this is the Great British Class Calculator, which is kind of based on what Bourdieu did. I don't know if I can. Can I?
You can. You just can't really see it. I'm not sure.
Oh my.
It's a bit weird.
Yes. So basically they ask you about yourself, and that's kind of like the idea of what Bourdieu did, like the economic, the social, and the cultural capital. Like, I don't know, does anyone want to do that with me, or should I just... Alexandra, do you want to do it? Okay, so the first question, what is your annual household income after taxes?
I don't even pay taxes.
Okay. So for me, I think it was under 10K. I didn't even think of this. So, do you own or rent property?
I do not.
Okay, so you rent, like this. So do you have any savings?
Only
Very little, so that's none, basically.
I love it that it says none and then 0 to 10.
To 10.
What is 0 something?
And okay, and then the social capital, which I said is kind of like your network, but in this case, it's kind of like the idea, well, which people do you know? So maybe just read through this and tell me, just read out loud which ones, or which kind of people do you know?
I know teachers,
Yes.
electricians, office managers, scientists.
You know me, I'm a shop assistant. Okay, next, and then we have the cultural capital, so you can just go through these and tell me what do you like to do in your free time?
Who doesn't want to go to stately homes?
Can you read it out, please? I have done
Can you see? No. Okay, so go to stately homes,
okay.
go to the opera,
Yes.
listen to jazz,
No.
listen to rock indie,
Yes.
go to gigs,
Of course.
play video games,
Yes.
watch sports,
No.
go to the theater,
Yes.
okay, exercise,
Yes.
use Facebook or Twitter,
No.
okay, good, socialize at home,
Of course.
go to museums or galleries,
Yes.
listen to classical music,
No.
do arts and crafts,
Yes.
watch dance or ballet,
Yes.
and listen to hip hop or rap.
Yes.
Okay, that's a lot. Okay, and then we basically have our result. Oh, you're emergent service workers.
Okay.
Okay, so I can just read it out. So you're young, you enjoy a cultured social life, and they rent their home almost 90%. This class group is financially insecure, scoring low for savings and house value, but high for social and cultural factors. Okay, want to see my result? It's worse, by the way. Why do I act like this? I'm not speaking into this.
No, don't worry, I think I can still hear you.
Okay.
And
Just the next slide. I don't know.
and let's move on.
Okay, so yeah, this was my result. Precariat, which is the poorest and most deprived class group, so the truly deprived. Okay, and this is tend to mix socially with people like themselves, come from a working class background, and rent their home. So, okay, I thought I wasn't the only one, but apparently I am. Okay. And so thank you for your attention. Those are my sources, so my bibliography and my pictures. If you have any questions, maybe we can put them to the back of, so we'll just listen to the other two. Thank you very much.
Maybe we should rename that class for the truly deprived and not depraved. We're just...
I made that joke, but no one laughed. So.
Oh, wow. Okay. I think we're going to move on in a second. Maybe not only the questions for the others, but I'm going to have some questions for the three of you potentially, so I'm also going to do that afterwards. That goes to your shirt, that goes into your pocket, or somewhere else. Okay. Where do you want to stand? Here?
Here is okay.
Or, yeah, sure. Then that's the kind of thing. So
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that also works. Perfect. And I'm going to
Switch the camera
Thank
on
you.
so that you are actually visible. Okay.
So, hello everyone. After learning about class, I want to talk about sexuality in class and want to give a short, more historic overview over the sexuality and classes. And I want to concentrate on Britain and majorly want to talk about the 20s to post-war 50s era. And at the start, I want to talk about the definition of the youth social classes because you have learned about theory already, but I just want to make clear what I'm talking about when I'm saying working class or middle class in this presentation. Then I want to talk about the sexuality in the working class versus the middle class. So, of course, there's the upper class, aristocracy is also a class. But I thought it would be more interesting to talk about working class versus middle class because I think the gap is the biggest there, and the contrast, especially talking about sexuality, is very visible. And I think it would be more interesting to talk about that because if you can say like there is a gap between middle class and upper class, but it's more people having prestige and people having more prestige, so the gap is narrower there. So I thought it would be more interesting to talk about working class compared to the middle class. And in the end, I will shortly talk about the upper class with some examples from films and series, and then my sources. Yes. So definitions of the classes. After World War I, there was a big political unrest. There was also a pandemic, Spanish flu, and mass unemployment, which affected all classes, but especially the unemployment affected the working class. Working class usually is persistent of factory workers, farmers, but in the cities where, of course, slums existed, factory workers are the main kind of people that make up the working class. Here you can see a picture of miners' housing in the 1920s, so you can make yourself have a look how the living conditions were back then. And at the time there were labor unions started to petition for child labor laws or workplace rights for women and men, but it was just like baby steps at the moment, so it was only the beginning. And in the 20s, there was also the women's vote in 1921. It started, but in 1928, every woman over 21 was able to vote. The school leaving age was raised to 14, and before it was lower, of course, so they kind of tried to prevent child labor, but only for 14, so from 14 to 18, you were still able to work. And of course, it is only the child labor protection laws were only effective for kids working in factories, and its labor at home did not count in, so you could not prevent that. Right. So there's this big unemployment in working class, which is a big problem, and on the other side, you have affluence in middle and upper classes. And in the mid-1920s, in some places of Britain, you had up to 70% of unemployment in cities, so it's really, really high. And after the 1920s, you delved right into the Great Depression of the 1930s and then into the Second World War. And then the post-war era, so it did not get that much better regarding to political unrest and all that. So, right. Here you have a picture of women doing office work in 1920, so you can have like a view on working conditions, maybe, how that looked. Right. So you have middle class. Middle class had more opportunities for self-sufficiency before and after World War I, and many people lost inheritance due to the war, but and had to start over. But the industry was there, so it really helped that you had education and families that supported you, so you could easily gain back your wealth and live comfortably. And you had access to education and culture, and it was usually expected for middle-class families to live off one income per couple, and if the woman was educated usually, and if the woman was working, it was expected that she stopped working once she had a husband and a child. Then you have upper class aristocracy. Here you have a picture of bright young things, so-called maybe the most known kind of person if you think about the 20s, the 1920s, the flapper girls and all this. And this is one example. It was usually upper class that could afford this kind of fun. So before World War I, you had usually upper class and aristocracy as landowners. So they got their wealth from their own ownership of land. But this land and wealth was heavily taxed after World War I, and many had to sell their homes, other assets, land, clothes, arts, etc., but only to maintain their way of life. So of course they lost a lot of things, but usually were still able to afford a higher class lifestyle, and still had the education that they were able to get, and still could partake in culture and fun and stuff. Right. They usually lived off inheritance or generational wealth, and if you were poorer in upper class, you still had education, culture, social privilege. This was not taken away from you because you already had it before. So you might be poor, but you still had cultural wealth in this kind of regard. Right. So, sorry. Now I want to talk about working class versus middle class. There have always been ideas about sexuality and female body, and it was always used to distinguish classes for the longest time. In the 19th century, you usually had middle class that used working class morality and promiscuity to distinguish classes. So working class women were usually seen as unmoral or more promiscuous than middle class women. And prostitution, maternity and work separated classes, bodies and sexuality. There was a clear distinction between middle and working class bodies, and usually the biggest factors that delved into this were motherhood and reproduction, because you had really no control over becoming pregnant at this point of time, because there was no birth control or no access to it. And the fertility deeply deepened the poverty of working class families, because when you were married, you could not prevent having a child, except you went to like backstreet abortionists, which are very dangerous, and a lot of people or women still did it, also in the middle class, but it wasn't very safe. So usually the more children, the poorer you got, and you could not prevent. On top of that, you really had to suffer from a lot of health issues, not only women, men also, due to the factory work or problems that you brought back from war. Some men never came back, but still you had usually health issues. The women, if you were working, you also had health issues, and also from bearing children. So birth control was the way to protect your household, your economy and your body. So this was the biggest goal that you had to achieve to gain some sexual freedom. So in the 1920s, working class women really desired to obtain the sexual knowledge, and there was a birth control advocate named Mary Stopes, and she tried to kind of reform the working class body in the middle class body, was already kind of seen as the reformed body in this regard. And at the time you had really high maternal mortality and morbidity rates, and also for the middle class, but the middle class usually had easier access to health not like more, they had access to healthcare or birth clinics, so the morbidity rates and mortality rates were very much higher for the working class women. And usually in the working class you had the mother as the defender for the home against poverty, that had to sacrifice herself for her family and her husband and also her own health to be able to survive. So you were unable to control reproduction, you had chronic unemployment and poverty, and also the decay of the male body due to malnutrition. Malnutrition was a very big problem at the time, not getting proper nutrients or proper food due to poverty, which also still weakened your body on top of that. So usually, or oftentimes, women in their 40s, 50s were so in such a bad shape that they were not able to work anymore, even though they had to support their families. And bearing children made this situation worse. And on the other hand side, on the other side, you had middle-class women who were able to live similar lives to their adult children in their 40s and 50s because they had access to healthcare. In the 20s, there were more birth control clinics in working class districts that were established, but the access was still not that good for working class women, and there was a society for constructive birth control and the National Birth Control Council, who tried to progress women's rights and empowerment of the working class woman and the working class body. And you could say there was a mild sexual liberation during the 1920s and 30s, but usually healthcare was not that accessible for working class women and more accessible for middle class women, so there was still this big inequality. And also maternal care usually more for the middle class women. And there was, of course, in the 20s and 30s, a big kind of movement of female social work, but this usually only happened in between classes. So there was, of course, middle class women who tried to help working class women, but this did not really work out, if you have to say it like that, because middle class women usually were the only women who had the time, because they weren't working to do social work, and there was still this big gap between the classes. And you have an example, like a 34-year-old woman in the working class had 18 pregnancies and has to refuse her husband to have sex until he overpowers her. And in this sense, you have a good husband is a man who leaves his wife alone. So male sexuality in the working class was always considered very predatory in this regard. So you always lived in this fear of becoming pregnant again, which really would worsen your health condition and your living conditions as well. So you really can't be sexually free as a working class woman if you have so many things to care for and if you're living this constant fear of getting pregnant again. So the woman is without rest and denied of all joy, kind of, and this really shapes your body as a woman, and fear is a big component in this kind of marriage in the working class. So on the other side, you have the middle class, where there is like an alternate sexuality, where sex became more of an expression of mutual love, and more middle class ideas came up for the sexual liberation for women. So you had like Mary Stuart's sex reform, where women claimed their sexual pleasure, and women became enlightened and liberal and more modern, and it was a newer approach to sexuality that usually regarded more like a hetero marriage, sometimes voyaging into same-sex experiments, as they called it, but it was more like considered as an earlier generation of feminists, but it was usually only accessible for middle-class women who had the prestige to delve into their sexuality like this. So importance of sexual pleasure was at this time very much known, how important it was for men and women, and also how important physical health, fitness, beauty were as goals for the sexual reform. So female pleasure is only possible when you have controlled reproduction. So it was, at this point in time, it was known, this is the goal we have to achieve. I brought to you a quote. Can someone please read it out for me?
I can.
Thank you.
A good deal of stability, a decent lad who you didn't expect to take advantage of you, who was easy on the drink and that sort of thing. You would be of a good, stable character, not fly by night. You had good, lasting relationships which barely touched on sex because you knew very well that one day things would come right and you'd marry and settle down, and that was it. And have children. And of course you knew very well that once you were married, there was no work for women. You left the office, that was it. Nobody forced you, but it was the understood thing.
Thank you very much. This was said by Gladys Hutchins in the 20s, and when she was asked to describe her ideal husband. And what do you think? Which class did Gladys? Which class was she brought up in?
I would say definitely middle class because it says
Yes.
once you were married, there wasn't work for women. So if she cannot work anymore after she was married, she must be middle class because that was the distinctive thing which you mentioned.
Yes, and also very noticeable, there is not really the mention of love, really. Where marriage, we had the presentation of marriage. Marriage is more economical thing or a thing you ought to do. So you could really see that she was a middle-class woman who had the possibility to look for a husband that, and she could live comfortably and not work, but she also did not really have the choice. Middle-class women were educated, but really did not have the possibility usually to work after marriage because they were expected to be a caretaker for their home, for their family, for the children. And was also expected to have children, so child-free marriage was not really in the picture. Right. So there you have the birth control movement, which was a modern, controlled, graceful middle-class body with access to sexual pleasure versus the uncontrolled, unmodern working-class body where sex was a danger to your health and for your economic status. So this birth control was very much needed for sexual modernization and for mutual sexual pleasure, was also needed for the happy marriage. And there was still this clear distinction between the working class and the middle class bodies, where like working class bodies usually were not in very good shape, and middle class bodies were where you are in your 40s and you're just as youthful as your adult children, and working class bodies were considered as withered in this context. So you had a much more older physical age, and you were also mentally exhausted from excessive childbearing, being a homemaker, and having to work. So birth control was needed, and there was slow social changes through kind of reshaping the working class women's bodies in the 30s, where women could stay younger for a longer time and have a freer sex life. But the working class women's bodies became the object of the reform, together with unemployment insurance, education, health, housing. So women's bodies kind of became a political topic in this regard. And there were also the upcoming theme of abortion, where women as workers, head of the domestic household, were very much needed to work, which you couldn't do if you were constantly pregnant. So women and juveniles made up to 75% of the wage-earning population in Britain in the 30s. So it was very much important that women were working. And there was also the social stigma around unmarried mothers. So you sometimes were forced to marry if you were pregnant, and then you are stuck in a loveless marriage, which was very unfortunate, of course. So there was more education for sexual education, because this was also not happening, really, especially not in working class districts. where you did not really have much access to education at all. So this was also one point that they were trying to focus on, to liberate women's bodies and bring more sexual education. And also have more accessible birth control, and kind of like abortion became an idea at the time. And they were trying to do this without reducing working class women's bodies to being weak and unhealthy. So after World War II, there was kind of a social and political change in Britain, and there was this kind of new post-war working class with welfare and full employment, which was not as estranged from society, which consisted of middle class and upper class. And in the 1950s you had the fertility was still an issue for working class women, but due to more access to birth control and sexual education, there were falling birth rates and a decline in maternal mortality and morbidity in the 50s and 40s. And there was this increased control of fertility, and a focus on happy marriages and healthy sexuality in a marriage, of course. And the working class became a bit closer to the middle class in their spending patterns, in voting habits, and sexual behavior also. So working class bodies were modernized through birth control. So you had this clear shifts in sexuality from the 30s to the 50s, and also in generational change. There was a famous sentence that was often heard, which was "not like my mum." And I brought another quote on playing hard to get. Can someone please read it out for me?
I didn't want to be bothered with men or anybody. I was that happy cycling. And then when I did meet my husband, I say,
Yeah, well, it's a quote, so I left it in.
well, I'm not seeing you on Sunday, I'm going out. The poor devil had to go and buy a new bike to come and catch me.
Right. This was said by Ida Greenwood, who was a member of the Clarion Cycling Club. And you can see there was a change in attitude regarding marriage and partnership. And women had, there was kind of a generational change. Women had a higher expectation from marriage in general, from partnership, from family, and also from their living standard. And in the 40s, the average children per family were 2, where before it was 4. So this kind of sense of voluntary parenthood became possible due to birth control. And the war was very much, you had absent husbands, female sexuality, and women working. Female sexuality became more of a topic, and women working was also very much normal at the time. So there was this promotion of female sexual pleasure for a successful marriage and this domestic stability, so keep your wife happy and your marriage is happy, all this. And there was this interwar sex reform, and a lot of marriage manuals came out, so how to please your husband, how to please your wife, which was also more normal for the middle class, but also working class women had now access to this. So there was still, this sounds good, better of course, but there was still a lot of problems in the working class sometimes. You had still less modernized working class, so there was no welfare, employment, again, and some were voluntarily against this bourgeoisement and modernization of the working class. So you had also still this aspect of unmodernized sexuality, and the gap between working and middle class was very much different in different parts of Britain. So men and women usually were still segregated at work, and you had also still this high power hierarchy at work. So this was still very much a problem, and coitus interruptus or withdrawal was considered a safe birth control method back then. So this was very widespread and very much unsafe. So the pill was not existent at the time, and this kind of contraception methods were very unsafe, and you still had to live in fear of pregnancies, of course. But also, still in the working class, women had higher expectations than their mothers, considered this new wave of generational change regarding happiness in marriage and sexuality. And sexual chaos was now replaced by more sexual control, and working class men were also, there was this more female participation in the workplace, so there was this kind of lowered pressure to be the sole breadwinner of a family, and you had like a not very balanced dynamic, but a more balanced dynamic than compared to middle class women who still were homemaker breadwinner with the husband working with the pressure on him to make money for the family, to provide. So female sexuality now needs to be satisfied within marriage, otherwise women were considered to be seeking other companionships outside of marriage, and there was also this kind of new working class masculinity where men did not force unwanted babies on their wives anymore and cared for their kids now, and were seen on the Sundays with a pram in the garden, all that. So this was now considered more a shift in masculinity, kind of, but especially in working classes. So the tensions between sexuality and between husbands and wife also eased the tension between classes in that regard, but still classes were still recognizable. Right, so now I brought for you some examples. The first example is for working class versus middle class, and I brought a clip from a BBC show called Call the Midwife, which is set in the 50s. So please just watch the clip.
I must have been mad. I could have been an air hostess. I could have been a model. I could have moved to Paris or been a concert pianist. I could have seen the world, been brave, followed my heart. But I didn't. I sidestepped love and set off for the East End of London because I thought it would be easier. Madness was the only explanation.
Only because he never paid.
What do you think, what class does Jenny belong to? Jenny's the nurse. So,
Well, definitely not working class, because she faces a working class world, basically, and is really shocked by the looks of her. And so I think she's at least middle class. Yeah, and I think so, because she has all those, as she mentioned, all those possibilities, going to Paris and doing whatsoever, and just wants to do something else.
yes, so Jenny had education, she's also culturally educated, and could have been all that, but became a nurse, and now she's faced with the working class, which was portrayed quite brutally, but this is the portrayal that the show chose to have. So now I have, a second example for the upper class aristocracy. Just a short clip, right?
Where's he going?
already enough, thank you. So, just for your information, this is from a show called Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries. And Miss Fisher is a lady detective in her 40s, unmarried, with many lovers, and chooses to work as lady detective but doesn't have to. So here you can see how differently her sexuality is. So she is sexually free enough because she is prestigious, she has a lot of wealth, she does not have to work, she made an inheritance, she is unmarried, in her 40s, so not really considered to be young. So she has all this privilege to be sexually free in the 1920s, in a contrast to where working class women and also middle class women had a different life. Yes?
May I add something to that? She also practices birth control because in one series or episode in the set she uses a diaphragma, so
Yeah.
she also has access to birth control.
Yes. Thank you. So, sorry. Yes, questions, I think we will have them afterwards. So, these are my picture sources and my literary sources. So, yes, thank you very much.
Okay, I do have to make two comments on that. Thank you very much. One comment pertains to the fact that we often generalize and put our own very much 20th century, 21st century views on the 20s, 30s and 40s. As Katharina has just noted, one of these characters practices birth control. Birth control was very much in the 20s, 30s and 40s a thing that was done. Condoms existed at that point in time, as well as the most famous pull-out method, which never really works, or at least generally not for a long time. But we cannot say that birth control, abortions, etc., didn't exist. Even safe birth control and safe abortions did exist. You mentioned that there were kind of abortion clinics. Mostly it was midwives, I don't want to call it, healers or anything, but usually there were people that did abortions. There were also, especially if we look at prostitution, there were people that came in after, the act was done and kind of cleaned out the vaginas of the prostitutes. So there were a couple of things that were being done in order to prevent pregnancies, and these were more or less pretty, safe, and they were pretty good, so they did prevent pregnancies. Abortions weren't exactly the coat hanger kind of abortions, but there were tinctures, there were kind of potions that were being used in order to abort a child. So very, very careful if we think about the 20s, 30s and 40s as this kind of primitive age before birth control. Birth control wasn't invented in the 1960s or 50s, and birth control in the sense of the pill started in the late 40s. Late 40s, early 50s were the first trials of hormonal birth control. And even before that, people knew, they might not have known about hormones and how they worked in terms of controlling, whether you got pregnant or not, but certainly people knew that certain plants, certain leaves, certain things you could put together actually prevented you from getting pregnant. So very, very careful with these ideas of, before that we didn't have that. That was something you did have access to in working class environments. Usually it wasn't as safe as you would have in middle class environments. And that brings me to a second comment. If we look at these studies, especially during those times, working class, middle class, etc., we need to be very, very, very aware of the fact who writes these studies. These studies aren't written, and these kinds of surveys aren't being done by working class women. They aren't being done by working class scientists, because something like that doesn't exist in the 1940s or in the 20s and 30s and before that. So all of these studies where, as you so rightfully said, where the body is considered withered and, working class women age far quicker than middle class women. Sure they do. because, being working class and not having access to economic capital always makes you 30 years older than, your middle class counterpoint. All of these things are very, very biased. So we need to be very critical of these studies, of these sort of overviews, of these surveys, because they are written with a certain class bias. So again, when we talk about these distinctions, we need to be really, really careful, and we need to look at them very critically, simply because we cannot simply reproduce these historical, in a way, inaccuracies, because they are not accurate as such. That is just a comment on making you aware of not how that works, but there are some things that we need to be careful with if we talk about these things. But before I start rambling on, and we're missing something here, let's move on to our last presentation for today. That is Katharina Hummel, who will finally go into Lady Chatterley's Lover. Not go into it, that sounds like you're entering a portal, but you know exactly what I mean.
Yeah.
Do you need anything apart from a cursor, maybe?
I have all I need.
You have all you need, that sounds good. And
That's it's a quote from a mousetrap, I just remembered. Doing too much theater.
Okay, so.
I also have brought a handout. I just printed it out 8 times, but I sent it and we can.
Yeah. So the handouts that I got and the presentations, they will be up on OPAL by the end of today, hopefully. I'm going to give you the microphone. Do you have any links, clips, anything? Good. Then I
just about the billion of quotes. No, that's wrong. Billion quotes.
Okay. Then we should be able to move on. You can use the clicker thing that's on there.
The clicker thing. So I just click there, or
should
no?
Work.
Like that. What do I do? What do I do? I will stand there because then I can see my presentation. Oh,
okay.
What has happened now?
I just clicked it.
Okay.
Maybe you need to just try again.
No.
If it doesn't work, then you have to be standing here, and then it
doesn't work somehow. But it does make red things.
Yeah. Weird. Maybe the battery is probably dead. So now you can see everything you can see yourself.
Okay.
And the presentation.
And I can see the time. That's awful.
Perfect.
Okay. So now let's go into Lady Chatterley's Lover and Class and Sexuality. It is, as you can see, a presentation by me in our seminar. And yeah, let's just start with my structure. Here you can see we'll first delve into class and sexuality in the book. First class, then sexuality and some scenes. And then I will further analyze the attitudes among the main characters. And I chose Clifford, Mellors, Connie, which are the main characters. And then I'll have a short conclusion and my sources. So now let's start with class theory application. We go back to Bourdieu, first to Habitus. And I want to say that Lady Chatterley's Lover acknowledges the concept of habitus in stating that life practices differ and are highly determined by the social surroundings and living conditions. I have found some quotes here, which I didn't print there. One is, the function determines the individual, which is pretty straightforward, and further elaborated in the following quote. Place any child among the ruling classes and he will grow up, to his own extent, a ruler. Put kings and dukes' children among the masses, and they will be little plebeians, mass product. It is the overwhelming pressure of environment. So also here exists the concept of, okay, what is around me determines who I am. What I do determines who I am, and yeah, results in a different practice of living. Yeah. Then forward with capital. Capital, as we already differentiated, has different realizations. First is economic capital, therefore money in Lady Chatterley's Lover. Clifford is a rather good example because he owns very much. Of course, he owns financial means. A quote here is that Connie accuses him of, you have only got more than your share of the money and make people work for you. So he bases his power, his
doing really on his money and on this capital. Another form of capital is education, and also the whole cultural capital thing, language, also traditions, aristocratic trends. And I have found some quotes. One is about Mellors, whom is said about. He'd been a clever boy, had a scholarship for Sheffield Grammar School and learned French and things, and then after all had become an overhead blacksmith shoeing horses. He was quite as clever as Sir Clifford. Really, some people can't get their chances when they got them. So it says here that he possesses, despite the fact that he has a working class background, much cultural capital in the direction of education, and that this gives you chances in rising or climbing the social ladder. Another thing is about Mrs. Walton, who is the nurse of Clifford. About their relation is said, yes, he was educating her. She was coming bit by bit into possession of all that the gentry knew, all that made them upper class, apart from the money. So here we can also go into taste and distinction by Bourdieu, because it says that she gets into possession of knowledge. She gets educated, she gets cultural capital, and therefore she gets something that is upper class and that makes the others upper class. And then there is this wide field of social relations and social capital, which can be of great help. You can notice this especially in the end when Connie is pregnant and wants to divorce Clifford. Then she can rely on her social relations. She can rely on her sister Hilda, who takes her to Venice and does all the things with her. Hilda also got a car, so she has a social relation, social capital, knows her sister, and therefore she has access to help from her sister. And also other people, for example, Duncan Forbes, whom she asks to say it is his child, and also the other people who help her get along. So much to this. Then I want to go on with distinction based on taste and habitus. I already touched upon it, but as Bourdieu says, people belong to a class as a result of conscious or unconscious collocations in taste and habitus in the social space. And Lady Chatterley's lover shows this in underlining signifiers like language, education, or personal design of space. These are part of one's identity and show how one lives, and furthermore give insight into class belonging. So you live a certain way, you talk a certain kind of English, you have certain things in your home or have not. You live in a home like Rugby, or you live like Mellors in a little house in the woods. So this also says something about who you are, what is your habitus, and is distinctive for your class belonging. A quote for this is also about Mellors. He says, "So I stopped talking fine, as they call it, speaking proper English, and went back to talking broad. I still read books at home." So you see here, okay, he could speak fine, proper English, but he comes back to the working class people in Teversol, and then he starts speaking dialect again because he fits in. But at home he still reads books, but this isn't considered working class, so he does it privately at home. And from the outside he really looks like a working class man. But here you see that really taste is considered class. Yeah, and I also have some examples here. Connie's room, for example, Mellors' room, but I think I already touched upon how home is also a marker of taste. Then I want to go into the social stratification by Max Weber. We already said that it is based on economic class, social status, and political power. And I want to exemplify this by drawing upon Clifford, because Clifford has high economic means. He has money, he has wealth, he has property, but he has less social status among his workers, because his workers, okay, they know he's the boss, but they don't really honor him because he doesn't really have influence on them in their in their status group, because they are a group in themselves. Whereas he has much influence in the mind sphere, so he really is acknowledged for his writing, he is famous, and so there he gets social honor and social status. And on the other hand, when it comes to real power and with the possibility to do things. He cannot really do some things physically because he is disabled, so he has little physical power, but he has lots of power when it comes to the mind sphere, because he can talk, he can think, and he can also influence ideas. So there is power, but unequally distributed, I'd say. And another thing is that this Marxist, well, I'd say Marx. I wrote Marxist concept. I don't know if it was really correct, but when I draw, when I thought about it, I think this stratification, economy, and who are you is little Marxist, which may be wrong. But this concept by Weber is inconsistent with Lawrence's idea of physical intimacy and the critics of, where am I? And the critics of industry. So Lawrence in his book really criticizes the industrialization and what it makes of the people. And he says that, okay, economic class, social status, political power, but it is not really important to people. And this is underlined by the following quote. A new race of mankind, overconscious on the money and social and political side, on the spontaneous, intuitive side, dead, but dead. So this is a quote by Connie, who gets to see some working class people and really is shocked by them, because she thinks, okay, they have all this, what is here said as being social class, but they are not people, because they lack of sensuality, they lack of emotion, and they are inside dead inside. Yeah. Now I go on into what is said about sexuality and class in Lady Chatterley's Lover. We have the basic distinction, body versus mind, and here it is. I can say that the upper class idea is the intellectual life is superior to the physical life. And there is a quote which reads, "They all believed in the life of the mind." So the upper class really thinks and they elaborate on things, but they don't really have a connection to their body. And there are differing opinions in there about importance, status, and necessity of sexuality, but it is really the upper class opinion is body unimportant, mind really important. And I think I can also here draw from Bourdieu with the form and function thing, because Bourdieu says that the working class culture focuses on the interrelation of form and function and subordinates the former. So for the working class, it is important what a thing can do for you. The function is important. The form, how it is done, less important. While the upper classes, here we go, adopt a distanced point of view, where the function is not that important, but more the form of it, and they engage in theoretical discourses and neglect the function for the form. The examples here are in the working class masses that sexuality has a pure procreational purpose. But the thing is, in Lady Chatterley's Lover, there is no detailed description of working class sexuality. We know, okay, they produce children by sexuality, but there is no conversation about sexuality among working class people. So I don't want to quote anything, and I don't really want to say anything because it's nothing written there. The upper class sexuality is following the above mentioned idea that sex is a matter of discussion and not practice. And I will elaborate on this later, because there are some scenes where sexuality is really discussed among the upper class. With regard to the middle class, there are maybe Connie and Hilda as examples, because there is a quote which says that Hilda is solid Scotch middle class, but this also is only a particular insight and no information about a general opinion. So the middle class is also not that described. I will now go into chapter 4 with you, because there is a situation where the crownies talk about sexuality. The crownies are Clifford and his friends, and they engage in a lively discussion on sexuality, while Connie sits in her corner and is the silent inspiration, but she doesn't really participate. She only listens. The protagonists are the young intellectuals of the day. They are all men and they are all upper class, so it is really people with one class background. And what becomes obvious here is that there are many different opinions also among the upper class. I think I will just read them out. Charles May says, it's just an interchange of sensations instead of ideas, so why not? And I need women sometimes. So he thinks, okay, sex is okay, it's like communication, we can do that, and I need it sometimes. Tommy Dukes also goes into that direction, and he says, sex is a sort of communication, like speech, underlining that, but contrasting May, he says, I'm nothing, just a squib. So he thinks he doesn't need sexuality in his life, which are really apart opinions, but they both think that sexuality is something you can do, or could do. Whereas Hammond, he is married, they are both not married, says it's all utterly senseless and pointless, a matter of misplaced curiosity. So he doesn't really want to talk about it and thinks, okay, it is okay to contain it in marriage, but we don't want to talk about it. But Dukes also says about him that sex is a vital little dynamo between Julia, his wife, and you, that brings success. So also Hammond gets something out of sexuality and sex, and thinks it's something where he can prove he's a man, he can have success. Clifford, however, has one slight problem. He can't have sex because he is paralyzed, or partly paralyzed. And he stumbles. I suppose marry and have done with it would pretty well stand for what I think. So he really is shy when it comes to sexuality, and also doesn't think it's a matter of curiosity and a matter that is important in life. He really engages in the life of the mind and talking about things. Connie sits in her corner, a silent inspiration, and she listens. And she likes to listen, that is said in the book, because the men reveal their minds before her. But it has nothing to do with physical intercourse, it's all just theory, what they're talking, which says pretty much about the upper class in this context. Another one is chapter 7, where sexuality in the future is discussed. Here we follow a discussion on a book about the future, and this also reveals attitudes towards sexuality. We have visitors at Rugby and the Chatterleys, and they engage in a conversation. It's all again upper class theory and has not so much to do with the body. The chapter elaborates on the concept of mind over body. Physical functions are seen as obstructive. So there is this middle quote, which is by Clifford, which summarizes what is said. He says, Connie says people like wisps, and Olive says immunized women and babies in bottles, and Duke says the first is the bridge to what comes next. So you see, okay, different opinions in the room. The book, by the way, is about future where women are immunized and babies are bred in bottles, so sex is not necessary anymore, at least not for procreation. And according to this, Clifford says, on the love business, for example, it might just go as well. Where a woman says, no, that might leave all the room for more fun. So you have different opinions. Okay, sexuality is something you don't need, and sexuality is really important to have fun, to be oneself, and to engage in it. And then there's this other side conversation where one says, certainly nothing but the spirit is worth having, so totally, mind is superior, body is inferior. And the other one answers, think so, give me the resurrection of the body. And here we have a central conflict in the book, this mind versus body thing. And Lawrence really goes into the direction of the resurrection of the body. He thinks it's important to have sex and a good sexual life, and that's where I would go into physical intimacy in the book. As I just touched upon, Lawrence places high value on a holistic kind of physical love as a foundation of a healthy relationship and salient for a fulfilled life. So you can see this in the chapters where Connie has no sex because Clifford is disabled, and really begins to wilt and is feeling like, okay, something is missing, I don't know what it is, but I'm not all right. I'm not a woman myself, and really she lacks something. And this is also what I summarized there. The Chatterley's marriage is disabled. They can't have sex, they can't have a healthy relation, and they can't fulfill themselves. And the affair between Connie and Mellors, in contrast, has this basis. They have sex, and they have this physical intimacy, and also this holistic kind where they have body and mind just really together. What I thought about when I drew upon also what was it, Marx? No, not Marx. We are not talking about Marx, Bourdieu, was that the concept, it focuses on people instead of capital, and it contradicts the class system in a way, because it says, okay, physical intimacy is important, but, well, not so much who you are, what you have, but only that you can engage physically. But in order to understand in this sufficient manner, people have to share some cultural codes, because otherwise they would just be totally apart from one another. And this is where class again comes into play, because class is, at last, according to Bourdieu, determined by taste. Yeah.
Just because we're
Absolutely short of time.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely short of time. I'd say we end it right here, if that's okay, or do you want to finish it? I'm not quite sure how long you still...
The thing is, I still have things, but I could do the next one, and then we come to the attitudes of the characters.
Yep.
So then I would say we do the next one, which is class complicates sexuality. Here we have this complication. Okay, class, sexuality, what is important? And the one thing is that physical intercourse is not wanted in public. Quote, "It's the one thing they won't let you be, straight and open in your sex. The hyena instinct of the mob against sex to pull him down." Okay, I shortened it a bit, but it's basically about manners in the end, who is really pulled down by the people who is loathed at because he has sex and now it's public. So sex really is a difficult matter, especially when it comes to practicing sex. And even worse is cross-class sexuality. It is highly despised. And I have found, you see quite an amount of quote, and I could have quoted, I think, 1,000 more things. You can read them, I will read them. "Think how lowered you'll feel. One of your husband's servants," is from Mellors when he talks to Connie. So he sees this, okay, I'm lower class than you, and it is lowering for you that you engage in sexual things with me. Another one is, "But he was quite consciously afraid of society, which he knew by his instinct to be a malevolent, partly insane beast." It's also about Mellors, who really thinks, okay, society and class is difficult if we engage in sex, him and Connie. And then something from Hilda, Connie's sister, when she gets to know that Connie and the gamekeeper have an affair. She thinks, okay, being solid Scotch middle class, she loathed any lowering of oneself for the family, and says to Connie about the working class people, "I may be on their side in a political crisis, but being on their side makes me know how impossible it is to mix one's life with theirs, not out of snobbery, but just because the whole rhythm is different." So here we can draw upon Bourdieu again and say, okay, their life, their rhythm is different, their habitus is different, they lead a completely different life, and so we can't relate. So class really manifests in this different rhythm, and therefore people can't mix in classes. And this is where really sexuality and class, especially in Lawrence's opinion, are totally apart and cannot be together, and class really complicates the whole matter. So that for the first part of my presentation, and next week we will go on with analyzing some people. I don't know, handout, but you will upload it, so yeah. I have brought some print versions, 7. And
7 people have the chance.
7 people have the chance to get a print out. I could even sign it. And yeah.
Okay.
Then I would leave the stage to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for being here. I just need my microphone.
You need your microphone. Sorry.
Nice to be with you. Thank you very much. Okay, so for next week, as Katharina has already indicated, we'll be meeting here for our next and last session. There is just one more thing. There's always one more thing, isn't there? There's one more thing. I'm going to send out 2 links. One will be a feedback, because usually there's an official kind of feedback channel for the university. I never use it because I ask not personal questions but general questions, really for my seminar. So will ask you to sort of go through those couple of questions, and I'm going to, because my plan was to do academic writing that everyone dislikes including me for the first couple of semesters, but we're still going to do that. I'm going to send out a sort of survey just to figure out where problems lie. So we're going to go through that, and I'm going to address problems that you might have as much as we can, and as much as we can manage next week. But for now, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for participation. Thank you to our presenters, and I'm going to see you next week.